"I can't believe this," I muttered, staring at the thick envelope stamped with the bold letters. Official notice. Immediate attention required. That alone told me it was from our ever-watchful HOA, Homeowners Association. If you've ever gotten one of their letters, you know the dread that creeps in even before you read the first sentence. Mine went something like this. "Dear Mr. Sutton, you have been found in violation of the architectural standards and guidelines pertaining to unapproved structures. You will be subject to a $100 daily fine unless the structure is removed within 7 days." I crumpled the note. A $100 fine every single day over a simple treehouse for my grandchildren? Let me just say, that's not how I expected my peaceful, early retirement to go. I'd moved to Hidden Lake Estates precisely for its quiet nature, wide, tree-lined roads, and the promise of an idyllic atmosphere in which to spend time with my 2 grandkids whenever they visited. But I'd made one mistake, ignoring the unspoken rule that the Homeowners Association has eyes and ears everywhere, especially in the form of Karen, our neighborhood's self-appointed monarch of compliance. Before we dive deeper, I want to invite you to keep reading to the very end and discover how I turned the tables on a meddlesome HOA and came out on top without sacrificing my grandkids' cherished hideaway. If you've ever had a pesky neighbor or run in with an overzealous rule enforcer, this story might just give you a trick or two for your own battles. I'd heard rumors about Karen before I even moved in. We all know Karen is a kind of catch-all name these days, but in our neck of the woods, that was her real honest-to-goodness name. She was legend in Hidden Lake Estates. She lurked around with a notepad, an actual notepad, mind you, not even a smartphone app, and wrote down every possible violation. Garbage cans left out a minute too long, holiday decorations hung 2 days too early, even lawn ornaments that looked too whimsical. She didn't discriminate. Older folks, single parents, families with young children, it didn't matter. If you didn't toe the line, you get a letter from the HOA board with Karen's scribbled notes attached for extra emphasis. Strangely enough, when I first met Karen at a neighborhood barbecue, she came across as a perfectly polite, well-groomed woman in her early 60s, wearing a pastel cardigan and silver reading glasses. She offered me a plate of deviled eggs and commented on how my front lawn reminded her of the English countryside, so immaculate, so well-kept. I'd thanked her, feeling proud that the endless hours I'd spent seeding and watering the grass were appreciated. But of course, appearances are one thing. Behind that friendly veneer, Karen was a rule-enforcing machine. Fast forward to last month, when my son Matt brought my 2 grandkids, Annie, 9, and Robbie, 6, to stay for a long weekend. I wanted their visit to be memorable, so I decided to build a small, rustic treehouse in the big oak tree in my backyard. As a grandfather, I figured it was a rite of passage to hammer together a scrappy but sturdy little hideout for kids. I had built one for Matt when he was a kid, and it was the talk of the neighborhood. So, fueled by nostalgia and a bit of misguided confidence, I gathered some leftover lumber, a box of nails, and borrowed a friend's power tools to get the job done. For a week, I worked diligently. My wife, Patricia, teased that I was more excited about this treehouse than the kids. Honestly, she was right. There's something so pure about building something with your hands, especially for the people you love. For hours each day, I measured, sawed, hammered, and assembled a little platform, railing, and a small roof to keep out the rain. It wasn't exactly an architect's masterpiece, but by the time I was done, the treehouse was cozy, safe, and perfectly situated to give Annie and Robbie a bird's-eye view of our yard and the street beyond. The grand reveal was a success. The kids squealed with delight, clambering up the wooden ladder to check out their new domain. They hung up string lights, spread out blankets, and laid claim to the entire space for reading, coloring, or just daydreaming. Hearing their laughter echo through the backyard brought me the biggest smile I'd felt in years. What could possibly go wrong? I thought. Then, a few days later, Karen arrived on my doorstep with that notepad clutched in her hand. She stepped in close enough that I could smell her perfume, some sort of floral lavender concoction, and informed me that the structure was violating HOA guidelines because it was not approved by the architectural committee. She said she'd have to submit her findings to the board. That was the first time I had an inkling of trouble. And now here I stood, reading the official notice, the threat of a hefty fine hanging over my head like a dark cloud. I noticed with a grimace that the letter was signed by none other than Karen herself, in her capacity as the chair of compliance. I let out a bitter laugh. Who else would it be? I tossed the letter onto the kitchen table, feeling my pulse quicken. The question was, should I take the treehouse down and avoid financial ruin? Or should I put up a fight? Something deep in my gut told me I wouldn't be able to forgive myself for letting Karen steamroll me without at least attempting to keep the kids' dream sanctuary intact. And so, with Patricia's support, I decided to stand my ground. Little did I know that this would become more than just a squabble over a treehouse. It would evolve into a neighborhood standoff that tested everyone's patience and sense of community. The very next day, I walked down Birchwood Lane to the HOA's office, a small, unremarkable building that doubled as a meeting hall. If you've never dealt with an HOA before, here's a tip. Never show up unprepared. HOA boards thrive on bylaws, rules, and regulations. They wield these documents like ancient scrolls containing cryptic spells. If you don't speak their language, you're automatically at a disadvantage. I came armed with my own arsenal, a printout of the current bylaws, which I'd painstakingly downloaded and read cover to cover the night before, and a folder of property records proving that the oak tree had been on my lot for nearly 40 years, long before the HOA or even Karen had set foot here. My goal was to find a sympathetic ear or at least to open some negotiations. Maybe there was a short-term permit option. Maybe I could pay a reasonable penalty and keep the structure. Something. Inside, the office smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. A stern woman at the reception desk gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, tapping her pen on a small notepad. People in this HOA sure love their notepads. "Not exactly," I replied. "I'm here about a notice of violation. I'd like to speak to someone on the board or the architectural committee about it." She raised an eyebrow, but before she could say anything, an officious voice piped up from behind a partition. "Mr. Sutton, I presume?" Out emerged Karen in all her pastel cardigan glory, armed with her trademark notepad and a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. I greeted her politely, though my blood pressure spiked just seeing her. She motioned for me to follow her into a small conference room. The walls were decorated with the HOA's mission statement in a fancy frame, maintaining community standards for a harmonious living environment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen cleared her throat, flipping open her notepad. "Mr. Sutton, as you know, Hidden Lake Estates maintains high standards for external structures. Residents are required to submit an architectural request form before beginning any new construction. That includes sheds, fences, play structures like, for instance, tree houses." I set my own folder down on the table and matched her cool demeanor. "I understand the desire to keep the neighborhood looking nice, Karen," I said, working hard to keep a respectful tone. "But this is a simple, small tree house in my backyard oak. It's for my grandkids, not a permanent eyesore. And I don't see anywhere in the bylaws that specifically bans tree houses." She lowered her gaze. "Ah, but the bylaws do state that any structure visible from neighboring properties must have prior HOA approval. Your backyard is visible from 3 other lots, correct?" "Yes, but—" "And did you submit an application for this treehouse?" she interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension. I paused, knowing I had to admit the truth. "No, but I didn't think." Karen cut me off again. "Well, that is precisely the issue. Not only did you violate procedure, but you built it so high that it's clearly visible. According to our guidelines, we can impose a fine of $100 per day if it's not dismantled within a week." She slid a typed form across the table. Notice of violation. A wave of frustration surged through me. I could practically see the smirk behind her carefully guarded expression. Still, I took a deep breath and tried diplomacy. "Karen, can we work this out somehow? I can repaint it to blend with the tree, or add some landscaping so it's not so obvious. I'm happy to listen to suggestions." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sutton. The board is unwavering on this issue. We must uphold the same rules for everyone, or the neighborhood deteriorates into chaos." She gave me a pointed glance, as if my little treehouse were about to bring on Armageddon. It was clear I was getting nowhere fast. So I thanked her for her time, though the last thing I felt was gratitude, and gathered my papers to leave. She followed me to the door, adding with exaggerated sympathy, "I truly regret that it's come to this. But rest assured, I'm just doing my job." My blood was boiling, but I managed a curt nod before stepping out into the crisp autumn air. Once I was a safe distance away, I let loose a few choice words under my breath. I realized there was no chance of reasoning with Karen. She thrived on the power of telling people what they couldn't do. If I was going to keep the treehouse, I needed a different tactic. Back home, Patricia read the official forms in stunned silence, her hand covering her mouth. "I don't want us to get in trouble, but it's so unfair," she whispered, her eyes darting to the backyard where Annie's handmade wind chimes were gently swaying in the breeze. I nodded. "I know. I'll tear it down if we have to, but not without a fight. There must be a loophole or something we can do. Maybe a variance or an appeal to the whole HOA board, not just Karen. She can't be the only voice that matters." I spent the evening reading every clause of those bylaws for a second time. I found vague references to play equipment and recreational structures, but the wording was ambiguous, with no direct mention of treehouses. I also looked into city ordinances, hoping to discover that the HOA's reach didn't extend to an old oak that might be historically protected. That's when a spark of possibility lit in my mind: the oak tree. The record showed it was a heritage oak, a century old, possibly older. Could there be legal protections for it? Maybe if the tree itself was protected, then any structure attached to it would also be off limits to interference from an HOA. It was a thin thread, but it was something. My plan was simple: gather evidence, talk to county officials about heritage trees, and see if I could make a case that the HOA didn't have the authority to force removal. The question: would it buy me enough leverage to keep the treehouse? I didn't know, but at least it gave me a glimmer of hope and a reason to stand up to Karen's overreach. The following morning found me at the county records office, a place as dusty and austere as you'd imagine. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, and a librarian-like clerk eyed me skeptically when I inquired about records on old oak trees. "Are you looking for a specific property line dispute?" she asked, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose. "Sort of," I replied. "I live in Hidden Lake Estates, and I've got a tree that I believe may be well over 100 years old, possibly a heritage oak. I'm trying to see if it's listed or protected by the county in any way." She let out a sigh that spoke volumes, but then she shuffled off behind a tall row of cabinets. A few minutes later, she returned with a heavy, leather-bound ledger of old property surveys. After flipping through the dusty pages, she pointed at a survey from 1922. My heart quickened when I saw a scrawled notation: "Large oak tree, EST age 75 to 80 years. If that was accurate, it meant the oak was around 170 years old today. If I could authenticate it, that might classify it under a county heritage program. With a polite "thank you," I carefully made copies of everything I could find. Then I dialed the number for the county's Department of Parks and Environmental Preservation. A cheerful gentleman named Greg asked me to email scans of the documents. He said an arborist would need to come out and do a formal assessment to confirm the tree's heritage status. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls and anxious waiting. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking on the HOA's ultimatum. I had 7 days to remove the unapproved structure or face daily fines of $100. Already, I was counting the hours, worried about the possibility of steep financial repercussions. But I also felt a surge of determination. I was not about to lose without trying every last option. Finally, Greg from the county called back. "Our arborist can come out tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll do a core sample to estimate the age. If it's more than 100 years old, the county will flag it as a heritage oak. That comes with certain protections against destruction or modification." That phone call gave me hope. If the tree is protected, then maybe the HOA can't force me to tear anything attached to it down. At least, that was my line of thinking. I couldn't wait to share the news with Patricia, who greeted it with cautious optimism. "Just be careful," she warned. "Karen won't take this lying down. She's not the type to roll over and accept defeat. Trust me, I said grimly. I'm counting on her pushing back. That's why I'm making sure every detail is airtight. Sure enough, the next morning, the arborist arrived in a county marked truck and spent a good hour circling the oak, taking measurements, pictures, and finally a small core sample from the trunk. He also snapped a few photos of the treehouse, perched among the branches. This is a solid tree, all right, he said, tapping the trunk. It's in great health, and based on the location of that knot and the growth rings we can see, I'd guess it's easily over 150 years old. You don't see oaks like this every day. He promised to expedite the formal report, then left with a friendly wave. Later that evening, an email arrived with an official letter attached, designating my oak as a county heritage tree. The letter stated that no major modifications or removal could be done without permission from the county. I couldn't help but grin. This was the ace up my sleeve. Armed with the arborist's letter, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to present my findings. Meetings were held in that same beige building on the second Tuesday of each month. Normally, about 5 people showed up, plus the board. But tonight, I discovered close to 20 neighbors in attendance, many wearing expressions that ranged from mild amusement to downright hostility. Word had spread about my conflict with Karen, and curiosity had evidently drawn a crowd. Karen sat at the head of a long table, with 2 other board members flanking her, a portly man in a polo shirt and a petite woman with a sharp bob haircut. Karen wasted no time calling the meeting to order. She sailed through the agenda, budget updates, a discussion about repainting common fences, and a reminder to keep dogs on leashes. Then she arrived at new business. Her eyes zeroed in on me. Before we continue, is there any new business from the community? I stood up. Yes, I'd like to address the matter of the treehouse in my backyard. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. A hushed murmur filled the room, and I could feel eyes boring into me from all sides. Karen pursed her lips. We've already issued a notice of violation. If you wish to submit an appeal, we can schedule a private hearing with the architectural committee. I nodded. I'm aware, but I have new information relevant to that notice. I passed out copies of the arborist's report, along with the county's designation. As you can see, the oak tree is officially recognized as a heritage tree over 150 years old. According to local regulations, it cannot be significantly altered or removed without the county's explicit permission. Karen skimmed the papers, her expression flattening. We're not asking you to remove the tree, Mr. Sutton, just the unauthorized structure attached to it. She tapped the paper with a manicured finger. I shook my head. The treehouse is attached in a manner that doesn't harm the tree. In fact, removing the structure might entail cutting limbs or otherwise damaging the trunk, actions that would require county approval. I suspect the county would not permit the tree to be compromised just to satisfy HOA regulations. A ripple of commentary went through the crowd. Karen stiffened. We believe you can dismantle it without harming the oak, she insisted. We can have our own inspectors. One of the other board members piped up. Actually, Karen, if the homeowner has this documentation, the county might override our enforcement if it risks damage to a heritage tree. We need to consult our legal counsel. A smile tugged at the corner of my lips. Finally, some sense. I looked around at the neighbors, spotting a few sympathetic nods. My friend George mouthed, "Good job," from the back. I felt a surge of pride and relief. Karen tried to regain control. Yes, we will consult with counsel, she said primly. And until such time, the notice of violation stands. I half expected she'd say that, but I had one last card to play. I'm requesting a stay of all fines until legal counsel clarifies the county's stance. In the spirit of fairness, it would be unjust to charge me $100 a day if I'm under the protection of the Heritage Program. A tense silence followed. Karen glanced at her fellow board members, her face taut with frustration. After a few seconds, she let out a curt sigh. Very well. We will suspend the fines until further notice. But the Architectural Committee will also conduct an inspection. Meeting adjourned. I'd won a small victory, a temporary reprieve at least. But I knew better than to think Karen would let it go that easily. She hadn't become the neighborhood's ultimate busybody by giving in at the first sign of resistance. If she was willing to show her claws over a minor fence height or a garden gnome, she'd undoubtedly go to war over this. The days after the HOA meeting felt strangely calm, though I sensed the tension humming beneath the surface. Karen had posted a brief update on the community's online portal saying that the board was reviewing compliance matters in line with county regulations. She never mentioned me or the treehouse by name, but everyone knew it was a veiled reference to our dispute. In the meantime, my grandkids came by for a visit, and Patricia and I let them romp around the backyard, climbing up and down the treehouse as if nothing was amiss. I couldn't bring myself to tell Annie and Robbie about the looming threat of fines or potential demolition. Instead, I urged them to enjoy their little hideout while they could. A part of me worried that we might lose the battle with the HOA, even with the county's heritage tree designation. Lawyers had a way of twisting facts. Plus, the HOA often had deeper pockets than a retired guy like me. But I was determined to see it through. Sure enough, one morning a week later, 2 members of the architectural committee showed up unannounced with clipboards and measuring tapes. Patricia and I were sipping coffee at the kitchen table when we heard them knocking. I sighed, marched to the door, and welcomed them into the backyard. A tall, wiry man with an official-looking ID badge introduced himself as Clark, and his companion, a brisk woman named Sandra, said they were here to inspect the treehouse for structural compliance and assess potential harm to the oak. I led them to the foot of the ladder. They spent the next 20 minutes circling the trunk, snapping photos, and taking notes. They even climbed up into the treehouse, Clark muttering about the angles of support beams, while Sandra tapped the walls with a small mallet. In the end, Clark flipped to the final page of his inspection form and jotted something down. "We'll file a report with the HOA board," he said. "In the meantime, can you confirm who built this, and do you have any experience in construction?" I raised an eyebrow. "I built it myself. I was a mechanical engineer before I retired. I'm handy enough to know how to frame a few boards safely." Sandra pursed her lips but remained silent, focusing instead on the visible nails and screws. I could tell they were searching for any excuse to label the structure unsafe or unsightly. When they finally left, I couldn't tell if they'd found anything to sink my battleship, but I steeled myself for the worst. Sure enough, I received an email from Karen a few days later. "Mr. Sutton, the architectural committee has deemed the treehouse to be in violation of several safety guidelines. Among other issues, the railings are substandard and the supports are insufficient for long-term structural integrity. We require you to make modifications or remove the structure entirely within 10 days. Failure to do so may result in fines or further action. Sincerely, Karen Hollings, HOA Chair of Compliance." I read it twice, growing more annoyed each time. This safety angle felt like a ploy, especially since I knew the supports were more than secure for a couple of small children. But they found a new angle to threaten me with. Patricia suggested reinforcing the railings and possibly adding another support beam, just to eliminate any potential cause for complaint. She was right. If the HOA wanted to push me on safety, I'd show them safety. That weekend, I got to work. I used extra wood to thicken the railings, added diagonal bracing under the platform, and even installed additional anchor bolts at strategic points to ensure the structure was rock solid. In the process, I made sure to film myself working, narrating each step to prove compliance. My neighbor George came by to lend a hand, shaking his head in disbelief at the lengths I had to go just to satisfy the HOA. When we finished, the treehouse could have withstood a small earthquake. I sent Karen pictures and a concise email. "Karen, I have completed several modifications to ensure the treehouse meets or exceeds safety standards. All changes were done in a manner that does not harm the heritage oak. Attached are photos and a brief summary of reinforcements. Please advise if there are any further concerns. Regards, Samuel Sutton." Days went by without a response. Then a week. The radio silence was unsettling, but I also felt a cautious optimism. Perhaps they were finally satisfied. I'd taken away their safety argument. The heritage oak status was ironclad. Maybe Karen was looking for a new hobby. Maybe, just maybe, common sense prevailed. It wasn't until the next HOA meeting rolled around that I discovered the outcome of my efforts. The atmosphere that night was tense. Karen wore a tight smile, and the other board members exchanged guarded glances. During the compliance updates, she cleared her throat and began reading from a prepared statement. After careful review by the Architectural Committee, we have determined that the modifications made by Mr. Sutton to the backyard treehouse sufficiently address immediate safety concerns. As the tree in question is a county-registered heritage oak, we cannot mandate removal without risking damage to protected flora. Therefore, the board will withdraw its notice of violation. However, she paused for dramatic effect. We strongly recommend that Mr. Sutton continue to consult with licensed professionals to ensure ongoing compliance with any future rule updates. Her voice betrayed disappointment, but the words were there in black and white. Withdraw its notice of violation. A mixture of relief and triumph washed over me. I caught Patricia's eye across the room, and she gave me a proud, beaming smile. A few neighbors actually clapped quietly. Others just seemed relieved the whole debacle was over. Karen moved on to the next item on the agenda with a sharp rap of her gavel, refusing to look my way. But I didn't need her approval or her glance. I had my resolution, and the kids had their treehouse. Later that week, I saw Karen walking her tiny dog near my driveway. We locked eyes for a moment. Her expression softened, and she offered a curt nod, something bordering on acknowledgement, maybe even respect. I nodded back. Sometimes winning a battle is enough. You don't need a parade or an apology. Just knowing you stood your ground and came out on the right side of things is victory enough. In the end, the lesson I learned was that rules aren't meant to bully residents into submission. They're meant to keep a community safe and harmonious. But when they're used as a weapon by an overzealous individual, stand your ground, especially when it comes to something as precious as building memories with loved ones. The Karen in your life might huff and puff, but with the right evidence, a bit of resourcefulness, and the backbone to push back, you might just keep the things that truly matter. For me, that thing was a treehouse perched in a centuries-old oak, still standing tall as the perfect spot for my grandkids' imagination to run free. And if you find yourself in a similar situation, remember, sometimes the biggest barrier is just working up the courage to fight for what's right. Because in the end, the best memories, like those made in a sturdy, lovingly built treehouse, are worth protecting at all costs. If you found this story relatable or useful, I encourage you to share it with someone who might be dealing with their own HOA nightmare. Sometimes all it takes is knowing you're not alone, and that, with persistence and maybe a little luck, you can prevail. Don't forget, stand up for what matters, especially when it comes to family and community.